Hello, I am Raymond Shadow. Imagine this. On a vast, boundless emerald prairie, a flock of sheep is leisurely grazing. But whenever night falls and the howl of a wolf echoes from the depths of the forest, they are plunged into extreme terror. These sheep spend their entire lives guarding against those glowing green eyes in the dark, huddling closely at the feet of the shepherd. Yet, the ultimate black comedy often reveals itself at the end of life. The one who finally serves them upon the dinner table is usually not the wolf that terrified them, but the shepherd they trusted so unconditionally. In this episode, we will peel back this glamorous veil called politics together. We will see how, over the past 2,500 years, politics has evolved from a rough, primitive piece of flint in the hands of early humans into a cold, sharp, and highly precise scalpel in modern society. Following this episode, you will understand exactly how those great thinkers evolved this thing called politics. It is actually driven by only two core fuels. The first fuel is extremely primitive, pure force. The ancient adage "might makes right" remains eternally valid in the underlying logic of human society. The greater the power you possess, the more violently you can stir the waves at the political poker table. Powerful individuals, interest groups, and even superpowers can always play this game with far more ease than the weak. It is like an underground boxing match with no referee. Unless you can knock your opponent to the ground with a few heavy, crushing blows, no one will patiently listen to your truth. But what if you are born weak? How do you survive in this Game of Thrones? This brings us to the second driving fuel of politics: deception. The deception here is not a low-level lie, but an advanced ability to use language and symbols to influence and even manipulate others. It encompasses rigorous logic, profound rationality, masterful rhetoric, and soul-captivating charisma. The great leaders in history have all been masters of manipulating language. With beautiful and sensational rhetoric, they effortlessly swayed the fates of millions. As civilization evolved, those beautiful words gradually solidified into constitutions, rulebooks, and legal frameworks. But please always remember, the underlying support maintaining the operation of these civilized frameworks is still that brute force that could erupt at any moment. Politics, in its essence, is the monopoly on violence. In exchange for peace, we unconditionally handed over our collective force to the police and the military. At any time, as long as we attempt to use private violence to obtain personal gain, we will immediately face a violent machine 100 times stronger than ourselves. And in the game between nations, once the red line is crossed, what is faced is a torrent of steel capable of destroying everything. In its mildest form, politics manifests as the civilized light of social contracts, the rule of law, and democracy. But in its worst form, it is like a bloodthirsty porcupine, transforming into dictatorship, tyranny, and despotism. On a deeper dimension, politics is actually a precise emotional management tool. It attempts to reconcile two completely opposite and extremely tearing desires deep within human nature. We desperately crave unconstrained freedom, yet pathologically pursue absolute security. Unfortunately, we can never have both simultaneously. So politics is like a pendulum that can never come to rest, painfully pulling back and forth between the extremes of freedom and security. The strong always favor more freedom to plunder resources, while the weak can only beg for security to preserve their lives. Let us turn the clock back to remote antiquity to explore the origins of politics as a biological inevitability. The great Greek philosopher Aristotle once revealed a profound truth. He declared that man is by nature a political animal. The fundamental reason humans evolved such incredible language abilities is that we have an innate desire to form massive communities. We need highly complex language to tell stories, find allies, and gain the upper hand in the brutal negotiations of resource distribution. In nature, we can see ants and bees forming massive empires with millions of members, but no mammal other than humans has been able to build a super beast with a population of 1 billion. Human behavior is governed by three underlying biological drives: finding food, reproducing, and acquiring a sense of belonging. This sociability etched into our genes dooms us to face others. When desires are infinite and resources are scarce, conflict follows like a shadow. Brothers turn against each other, fathers and sons draw swords, and rivers of blood flow between tribes. So how does nature handle this internal contradiction? The hand of evolution has provided two completely different sets of programming. The program of violence: individuals with larger fangs, harder horns, and stronger muscles win the lion's share of food and mating rights. This model is most common among carnivores like lions, filled with unpredictable bloodshed and caprice. This also dooms the group size of carnivores to forever be limited to a few dozen to a few hundred. The essence of violence causes massive social structures to collapse instantly. The program of order, stable and predictable, much like that of ants and bees. In that microscopic empire, every member knows their place from the moment they are born. Because they feed primarily on plants, the rhythm of their lives depends entirely on the stable alternation of seasons. This predictability allows them to build astonishing social machines of millions. The trajectory of human destiny lies exactly between the violent lion and the orderly ant. We were originally just a small group of hunter-gatherers struggling to survive in the wilderness. But the great discovery of agriculture completely rewrote the fate of our species. We transformed from opportunistic hunters into farmers pollinating wheat and rice. Along with the massive cities rising on the banks of rivers, myths and stories were created to serve as a cohesive glue. Ironically, farming made our legs shorter, our muscles atrophy, and our teeth degenerate. We no longer needed to engage in close combat with wild beasts just to fill our stomachs. Humanity forcibly domesticated itself from a small group of carnivores into a massive herd of herbivores. This is also why we today are so prone to storing fat, with nearly 3 billion people worldwide plagued by obesity. But please do not assume that a vegetarian diet means peace. Archaeological data coldly shows us that with the spread of agriculture, violence between groups experienced an explosive surge. To find justification for this endless slaughter, extremely complex religious myths were woven. They packaged the struggle for interests into sacred wars between good and evil. This fictional power acts like an extremely powerful software program, making empires indestructible under a shared narrative. Countless people willingly sacrifice their lives to fight against so-called evil. Here, violence is like a spark of fire controlled by humans. If managed properly, it can cook a delicious dinner in the fireplace. If it loses control, it will turn into a monstrous inferno that burns enemies and oneself into ashes. Thus, politics was born. Appearing in the guise of the state or government, it became the ultimate tool to control and guide this fire of violence. In the ancient East, the sages of China and India pioneered a political system that imitated the laws of nature. They attempted to use insurmountable fate and birth to extinguish the rebellious flames in human hearts. Confucius observed the self-organizing methods of nature with a profound gaze. He astutely perceived that the greatest source of violence in human society often stems from confusion of identity. When people do not know where they should stand, what they should take, or whom they should obey, the slaughter begins. Confucius elevated this logic into social harmony achieved through a hierarchical system. He constructed an extremely rigorous pyramid, ensuring everyone clearly knew their coordinates. Let the ruler be a ruler, the subject a subject, the father a father, the son a son. There was no longer the chaos of multitasking, nor the conflict of overstepping boundaries. In this system, not only must you remember your own place, but you must also constantly keep an eye on others' places. There is no need for a massive police force to patrol the streets, everyone becomes a node in the surveillance network. The moment someone tries to sit in a chair that does not belong to them, the people around them will immediately rise up and attack. In Confucius's blueprint, true harmony is absolutely not built on illusory, absolute equality, but within an indestructible pyramid structure where every stone is firmly pressed down by the weight of the others. Responsibility, loyalty, and respect form the spiritual skeleton of this society. Those in high positions must practice benevolent governance in return, while those at the bottom must faithfully perform their duties. But this inevitably brings the risk of tyranny. To prevent the utter corruption of power, Confucianism designed a reverse accountability mechanism. A tyrant who cannot protect his subjects is unworthy of the throne, a father who cannot shelter his family is unworthy of respect. As if this were not enough, they also had the ultimate weapon of meritocracy, the imperial examination system. It acted as a precise pressure valve, allowing the smartest and most ambitious minds from the bottom to flow to the upper echelons. This system greatly dissipated the resentment of the lower classes, injecting hundreds of years of vitality into the empire. Unlike Confucius, who dedicated himself to solving internal contradictions, his contemporary, another genius named Sun Tzu, turned his gaze to the brutal external struggle for survival. Sun Tzu coldly revealed the truth of the natural world. There is absolutely no room for honor, fairness, or justice. In Sun Tzu's worldview, survival and conquest are the overwhelming, ultimate laws. When your muscles are not as strong as your enemies, nature has long prepared a deadlier weapon for you, camouflage, deception, and ultimate manipulation. The art of war is not just a military treatise, it is the culmination of human philosophy on deception. All warfare is based on deception. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable, when using our forces, we must seem inactive. These tactics are seen everywhere in the survival games of wild animals. A gazelle facing a cheetah will deliberately jump higher to display stamina, a squid fleeing for its life will squirt ink to muddy the water. And in human wars, intelligence gathering and spy infiltration often decide the outcome before swords even clash. The same political wisdom was reflected even more extremely in the caste system of ancient India. Vedic texts like the Purusha Sukta clothed this hierarchy in a sacred cosmological guise. It proclaimed that humanity was formed from the different body parts of a cosmic primeval man. From the mouth came the Brahmins, who mastered spirit and knowledge. From the arms came the Kshatriyas, who wielded swords to defend the kingdom. From the thighs came the Vaishyas, responsible for producing wealth. And from the soles of the feet came the Shudras, who bore the suffering of society. This hierarchy, branded into the bones from the moment of birth, ruthlessly extinguished all illusions of upward mobility, thereby trading for the ultra-strong stability of the social structure. And Kautilya, in his Arthashastra, provided kings with an extremely cold-blooded and pragmatic statecraft. The king must be an absolutely rational calculating machine, never kidnapped by any sympathy or morality. In a world of scarce resources surrounded by wolves, spies, assassinations, alliances, and betrayals are the only truly effective political bargaining chips. When we turn our gaze to the ancient West, Greece and Rome, a completely different, highly idealistic political experiment was underway. The Greeks were not satisfied with merely maintaining social harmony for survival, they began to crave a realm known as the good life. They pioneered democracy, even though it excluded women, slaves, and foreigners. Yet this was still the first great attempt in human history to allow ordinary citizens to participate in the game of power. However, this system immediately revealed its fatal flaw. In 399 BC, the democratic mob of Athens sent the father of Western philosophy, Socrates, to the execution stand. Simply because his relentless questioning made the uneducated, mediocre masses feel terrified. Socrates deeply loathed this absurd system that equally distributed power to the ignorant. He believed that giving a totally illogical simpleton the same voting rights as a wise man was simply a blasphemy against politics. After witnessing the tragic death of his teacher, his student Plato let out an angry roar in the Republic. Democracy was nothing but a fascinating illusion full of diversity and disorder. When everyone is driven by the desire for profit, frantically pursuing material wealth, the entire society descends into petty squabbles, and no one cares about the supreme common good anymore. Plato's ultimate antidote was to find philosophers who were completely detached from the vulgarity of money to serve as kings. Only those philosophers with souls noble enough to perceive cosmic truths could transcend narrow self-interest and lead society toward true virtue and beauty. Aristotle was far more pragmatic than his teacher. He no longer looked up at those ethereal, perfect ideals, but lowered his head to observe actual nature. He viewed human society as an organic entity constantly growing, like a biological organism, from family to village to city-state. To be human meant one must live a social life. A person detached from society is either a god high above or an irredeemable beast. He categorized political systems with the precision of anatomizing an animal into 6 major types. After rejecting the cruelty of tyranny, the greed of oligarchy, and the corruption of democracy, he concluded that a republic that benefits the majority is the most reliable hotbed for cultivating citizen virtue. The Romans brought Greek philosophical speculation into the flesh and blood reality of politics. Thinkers like Cicero and Seneca had their hands covered in the mud and blood of politics. They knew deeply that before you can speak eloquently about virtue, you must first possess an extremely efficient state machine. The tripartite model of consuls, the Senate, and the popular assemblies designed by Cicero not only laid the cornerstone for the Roman Republic but also became the blueprint for the US Constitution 2,000 years later. And Marcus Aurelius, a true philosopher-emperor, used his entire life to practice stoic endurance and restraint. He proved that a monarch with absolute power could still prioritize reason and the public interest over personal lust for power and greed. At the close of the ancient world, human politics fell into an unresolvable dead knot. Neither the insurmountable strict hierarchies of the East nor the wise philosophical deliberations of the West could overcome the 2 most fatal flaws of humanity as a biological species. First, all rulers cannot completely rid themselves of selfish desires and the corruption of power. Second, even if we miraculously found a perfect ruler, he is still mortal. Once the throne is left empty, what follows is often a bloody power vacuum of fratricide. Humanity despaired to find that a perfect, eternal shepherd could never be found among their own kind. Since there was no answer on earth, humanity could only cast their desperate gaze toward the deep, boundless sky. So, what if an absolutely just, omniscient, omnipotent, and immortal ruler took over our politics? Where would humanity's destiny head? The wheels of history ruthlessly rolled forward. With agricultural civilization accumulating massive material resources, the age of empires descended. The ambitious Persians were the first to create the domineering concept of the king of kings, using a massive royal authority to swallow countless small kingdoms. At almost exactly the same time, the divine realm in the heavens cooperated with the swords on earth to complete a unified reshuffling of power. Zoroastrianism, as the first monotheistic religion, quietly rose on Persian soil, declaring the end of the chaotic wars among the polytheistic gods. Later, the massive Roman Empire extremely astutely honored Christianity as the state religion, completely establishing the one true God in heaven and on earth. When there is only one person in the room, there are no conflicts involving drawn swords. This is the core ruling logic of monotheism. Without sacred rivals, everyone could unite around this almighty God on an unprecedented scale. Monotheism, like a prairie fire, swiftly swept across the entire world alongside the iron hooves of empires and the camel caravans of merchants. Sometimes, they would also use extremely cruel fire to burn those pagans who refused to submit, ruthlessly replacing animism. Today, Christianity and Islam have become the most extensive and deeply rooted belief systems on this planet. The Roman Empire, and later the Vatican, cleverly utilized this belief, claiming that their political legitimacy came directly from God. Since God is the ultimate ruler, it means no single person on earth is qualified to challenge his authority. This was absolutely the most genius, earth-shattering move in the history of human politics, instantly dissolving all ambitions to usurp royal power. Because when everyone becomes a humble, equal creature before God, the sparks of rebellion are completely snuffed out. But this brilliant political gambit of putting God in charge also brought profoundly far-reaching side effects to human civilization. Since an omniscient and omnipotent God was now responsible for taking care of everything, humanity comfortably sank into extreme laziness. People no longer needed to rack their brains thinking about how to draft complex laws and governance rules, because God had already paved all the paths. All authority stems from God. Jesus Christ had already set everything up. All humans needed to do was close their eyes and obediently follow along. This directly caused Europe to plunge into that long period of stagnation known as the Dark Ages, because the human brain completely gave up thinking. Even though those Christian laws were penned by humans, absolutely no one dared to scrutinize or question them. However, in 410 AD, a terrifying tragedy occurred that completely shattered the mental state of all devout believers. The Western Roman Empire, which had survived for centuries, collapsed in ruins just 30 years after very high-profilely adopting Christianity as its state religion. People could not help but ask despairingly amidst the rubble, how could the Almighty God stand by and allow his empire to suffer such humiliation? To save this unprecedented crisis of faith, the thinker Augustine of Hippo stepped forward and provided an extremely brilliant answer. In his immortal masterpiece The City of God, he used a magnificent perspective to split the entire world into two, the city of God and the earthly city. He ingeniously argued that the fall of Rome had absolutely nothing to do with the great Christianity, and believers did not need to feel guilty. The reason the empire turned to ashes was that, in its bones, it was still a secular city driven by power, desire, and greed. The political antidote Augustine provided was extremely simple and direct. The secular state machine must absolutely obey the guidance of the church. To ensure the ruler did not deviate from the sacred track laid by God, an embassy of God, namely, the church, had to be built right next door to the mortal's palace. The church was like a strict wife who never makes mistakes, constantly keeping an eye on the secular monarch to keep him alert and prevent him from falling into the abyss. For those ordinary citizens struggling at the bottom, Augustine told them this suffering-filled mortal world was just a temporary holiday hotel. Despite the temporary hardships of life, people should still grit their teeth and practice justice until the eternal gates of heaven roared open for them. Entire Christian Europe meekly accepted this political advice in full, kicking off a millennium-long model of church-state cooperation. The Frankish kingdom allied closely with the Catholic Church, while the Byzantine Orthodox Church bound itself deeply to the Eastern Roman Empire. The Pope generously draped the sacred cloak of legitimacy over the king's rule, while the king obediently bowed his head and listened to the Church's commands. During this long millennium, Europeans fell into a deep slumber in God's cradle. When you have an omnipotent Heavenly Father meticulously looking after you, you can simply lie at home and relax. But fate's heavy hammer always strikes unexpectedly. Muslim armies, also claiming the protection of the true God, swept like a hurricane and conquered the sacred Holy Land. To reclaim their lost glory, European Christians launched the 200-year-long crusades like moths darting into a flame. Yet, in this bloody meat grinder, the Christians ultimately lost the battle miserably, watching helplessly as Muslims firmly held the Holy Land. The absolute humiliation of defeat ruthlessly shattered the perfect myth of God as an invincible protector, causing the foundation of faith to waver. However, this extremely tragic clash of civilizations unexpectedly brought back the most precious spoils of war that would illuminate the dark Middle Ages for Europe. Through Arabic translations, European scholars rediscovered the forgotten rational works of Plato and Aristotle like finding priceless treasures. This rekindled frenzy of rationality began to quietly shift the center of gravity of politics away from blind dependence on deities, back towards human-centric wisdom. The theological giant Thomas Aquinas observed nature with extreme acuity and profoundly realized that only humans possess the light of reason. He concluded with absolute certainty that this ability for rational thought is exactly the most precious gift God bestowed upon humans to distinguish them from other beasts. He used rigorous logic to construct three legal systems, perfectly bridging the eternal law that rules the universe with the natural law determined by reason, and finally supplementing it with human law, created by humans to handle crimes and punishments, to govern the complex social community that sets humanity apart. Unlike Augustine's system of pure divine rule, Aquinas cleverly shifted the focus of social governance to a more rational track. He firmly believed the ultimate mission of human society is to educate citizens to use reason to think, thereby guiding them to live morally according to God's rules. This all worked as precisely as a mathematical formula. As long as you possess reason, you will naturally find God and create perfect political laws. But this seemingly perfect theory still faced an extremely thorny reality bomb. God, after all, is mainly an absent father who lives in heaven, while the human game of power is constantly filled with flashing swords. When a life and death dispute erupts between the Pope and the King, who exactly holds the absolute veto power? Giles of Rome stepped forward forcefully to set the tone for sovereignty. He declared categorically that the Church always possesses an absolute authority far higher than the King's. He used a vivid metaphor to humiliate secular royal power, saying, "Politics is only fit to manage this transient mortal world's shabby two-star motel. Religion sits high above, it manages that luxurious five-star heaven leading to the eternal world. The king is nothing but a temporary watchdog set up by humans to solve crime problems. Once he goes too far, the Church has the absolute power to intervene and twist his ear." However, amidst this endless tug-of-war for power, Europe's political landscape was gestating an earth-shattering earthquake capable of tearing the sky apart. The thinker Marsilius of Padua let out a deafening roar during the life-and-death struggle between the Roman Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. He sharply stripped away the hypocritical facade of theocracy, declaring that the source of the king's legitimacy to rule was absolutely not the Pope, but the collective will of the people. Jesus was merely a teacher spreading the word. If the Pope insisted on acting like an emperor greedy for power, he completely forfeited all moral authority. The king not only should not listen to the Pope's blind commands, but should actually, humbly, obey the collective will of the people through a representative council. Because the king's treasury is filled by taxing the general public, and it is the subjects at the bottom who shed their blood on the battlefield to save the kingdom. This was the first time the loud and clear clarion call for the separation of church and state echoed across the European continent. Secular power began to crash heavily back down from the heavens to earth. This was completely different from Christianity's adoption model, which maintained a delicate distance between church and state. In the vast world of Islam, the spiritual leader and the political leader were perfectly fused from the very beginning, like a sharp double-edged sword. The Prophet Muhammad was not only the messenger delivering divine revelations but also the iron-fisted leader who led his followers to establish a regime and draft a constitution in Medina. In this extremely tight system, Allah is the sole and absolute sovereign power in the universe, and the ruler's authority can only come unilaterally from Allah. Therefore, the political leader only needs to be responsible to the God high above, without paying any attention to the collective will of ordinary mortals. Since human nature is full of greed and cruelty, the most perfect shortcut to absolute peace is to make Allah the supreme legal mediator. Through the fanatical defense and fierce expansion of jihad, the Islamic Empire created an astonishing territory even vaster than the Roman Empire. During the Golden Age centered in Baghdad, Muslim scholars melted Greek philosophical treasures and Indian mathematical wisdom into one furnace. The great thinker Al-Farabi attempted to rebuild Plato's political ideals on this soil. He deeply knew that a philosopher possessing only reason and virtue could not hold down the fort. The most perfect leader must be a philosopher prophet or imam possessing divine knowledge, because only by following Allah's absolute commands can the ignorance and fear in the city-state be completely cleansed. However, Al-Farabi's lofty philosophical utopia was soon mercilessly shattered by another intellectual giant emerging from the realistic mud of North Africa. Ibn Khaldun, known as the father of modern sociology, used his extremely cold and piercing gaze to accurately dissect the rise and fall of human tribes. He threw a chilling definition of government at all of humanity, directly tearing off all the affectionate disguises of politics. A government is essentially a terrifying machine that monopolizes violence and, in the name of preventing injustice, commits even greater injustices. It ruthlessly deprives others of the ability to do evil, yet openly grants itself the supreme privilege to legally do evil. Ibn Khaldun coldly observed the bloody cycle of history. When a thoroughly corrupt old regime oppresses people until they cannot breathe, a new faction full of vitality and a sense of justice will rise up, overthrow the tyrant, and make hypocritical, rose-colored promises. But once these new masters settle comfortably onto the throne and enjoy the extreme comforts of power, they immediately cast justice and fairness to the back of their minds. They will maniacally tax the people like vampires, purely to maintain the extremely lavish and unrestrained lifestyles of the rulers. At this point, the political institution has completely degenerated into a private tool for the elites. They use the preservation of the state to whitewash their bottomless plunder of private interests. The dark clouds of tyranny shroud the earth once again, the seeds of hatred sprout anew, until the next batch of angry revolutionaries raises their butcher knives once more to overthrow the regime. This suffocating succession of dynasties is like a life experiencing birth, growth, and then irreversibly heading toward decay, an extremely cruel, inescapable loop of history. However, as the wheels of history rolled into the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe, extremely dangerous cracks began to appear in the dome of faith. The absolute authority of the Church, once thought indestructible, headed towards decline in the secular storms in a slow but irreversible posture. One of the most fatal catalysts for this was the powerful Islamic military force ruthlessly crushing the last afterglow of the Roman Empire. When the walls of Constantinople came crashing down under fierce artillery fire in 1453, Europeans plunged into an unprecedented, extreme disillusionment. In this cruel baptism of blood and fire, the European elites awakened to an icy reality. When facing the tough steel scimitars of the Muslims, relying merely on illusory religious faith was completely insufficient to survive the brutal geopolitical game. Driven into a corner, they could only cast their gaze for survival back to the pre-Christian era that had long been dusted over by the Church. During this era of wild transformations, the Italian Renaissance gave birth to an intellectual eccentric who saw through all the codes of power, Niccolo Machiavelli. In his monumental book The Prince, revered as a Bible by countless ambitious schemers of later generations, he offered rulers the most cold-blooded advice explicitly. He taught that monarchs must unscrupulously use any possible method to madly seize power and desperately maintain their absolute rule. Because in this bottomless world, as long as you reach the ultimate pinnacle of power, any despicable means can be effortlessly whitewashed as justice. A true king must be ready at all times to transform into a brutal lion capable of tearing everything apart, while also lurking in the shadows as a tremendously cunning fox. On Machiavelli's cold political dissection table, words shining with humanistic glory like freedom, justice, and morality are indeed very beautiful. But this is absolutely not a heavy cross that a mature state should bear. The primary and overwhelming ultimate responsibility of the state machine is to extremely selfishly maintain its own massive operation of power. Because once it loses this formidable power, the state beast will instantly degenerate into a useless corpse at the mercy of others. Next, the state's second core task is reluctantly keeping the basic safety of the ant-like citizens beneath its feet. In other words, in this meat grinder of the law of the jungle, the safety to keep one's life is thousands of times more important than hypocritical moral goals like justice, freedom, or happiness. He left behind that chilling, immortal quote, "It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." Although this lonely wise man lived centuries before Darwin proposed the theory of evolution, he had already precisely captured the most fundamental barbaric essence of human politics. Cold, ruthless biological evolution will always only favor absolute winners whose hands are covered in blood. To Machiavelli, political rule is absolutely not chanting hymns at an altar, but playing a highly dangerous game of chess on the board of life and death. In this game, the only thing that matters is whether you ultimately win the world. As for how dirty the methods you used in the process were, no one truly cares. He sharply pointed out that as long as a prince is not subjected to the weak reckoning of justice in the end, the result in his hands is the only standard for judging everything. As long as you finally sit on that throne symbolizing absolute power, those extremely bloody and cruel means you used will always be flatteringly touted by the blind, forgetful mob as a glorious, even monumental achievement. Because the intelligence of the masses can only ever superficially follow those glamorous appearances and the final results written by the victors. And this so-called civilized world, in Machiavelli's eyes, contains nothing else truly valuable besides these easily manipulated masses. Earlier we heard Ibn Khaldun lament the irreversibly corrupt nature of politics and the ruthless rise and fall of civilizations with an extremely pessimistic tone. But here, Machiavelli arrogantly subverts this tragedy. He doesn't think the coldness of power is a disaster at all. He astutely pointed out that a ruler who truly desires absolute obedience from the masses must first master how to issue unquestionable, cruel orders. To ruthlessly snuff out any spark of rebellion in its cradle, a ruler must constantly display a suffocating, terrifying power to society. Sitting in that supreme position means everyone in the world is staring like hungry wolves at your lucrative job. So, in any tiny moment of weakness, countless hands hiding in the dark might try to ruthlessly drag you down from the pinnacle of power. Therefore, the highest rule of life and death is that you must ruthlessly deploy any thunderous means at your disposal to brutally ensure you forever tightly grasp your absolute power and your mountain of wealth. The ideological core of this Italian eccentric actually shares an astonishing cross-temporal resonance with Sun Tzu and Kautilya in the distant East. They all cold-bloodedly believe that on the edge of life and death, the instinct for survival absolutely overrides any hypocritical morality. In this cruel game, becoming a terrifying great man is always much more important than being a bullied good man. To this day, the name Machiavelli remains the perfect synonym in the business jungles and political abysses for that ruthless ideology of the ends justifying the means. Especially on the treacherous stage of international politics, this hardline realism remains the absolute dominant ideology governing the game between nations. A nation only deserves a voice on this cruel planet when it displays terrifying power sufficient to destroy its rivals. Meanwhile, in a France devastated by the roaring flames of religious wars, Jean Bodin was pondering bitterly alone in a pool of blood. At that time, Catholics and Protestants were like two packs of irrational beasts, engaging in horrific mutual slaughter on French soil. Witnessing this bottomless chaos caused by a power vacuum, Bodin let out a desperate cry in his masterpiece The Six Books of the Commonwealth. He firmly echoed Machiavelli's iron-blooded assertion that a monarch must possess absolute power. He even believed that in order to desperately maintain that shaky rule, the monarch could arrogantly override secular laws and weak morality. Because as long as there are two evenly matched competing powers in this country, it will inevitably and fatalistically lead to a devastatingly cruel conflict between them. But if there is only one absolute ruler with terrifyingly immense power on this land, absolutely no sane person would dare to challenge his reverse scales. While Machiavelli's extremely greedy political goal was to selfishly maintain and madly amass more private power, for the war-torn Bodin, his pathological pursuit of absolute power was actually to trade for that incredibly precious peace. In a bizarre dimension, this is very similar to the terrifying nuclear deterrence hanging over all humanity today. Precisely because this absolute power possesses a terrifying destructiveness capable of flattening the entire Earth instantly, it ironically creates a longer-lasting peace. For a true sovereign, the logic is the same. When his power inflates to an overwhelmingly terrifying state, no sane person would even dare entertain the thought of challenging him. Bodin went even further than Machiavelli, stubbornly believing that the power possessed by this sovereign ruler must not only be absolute but also permanent. His grand discourse played a crucial role in finally forming strong, unified nation-states across the fragmented European continent. Like a hard steel nail, it firmly secured the absolute, unshakable power of sovereign rulers over these emerging nations. To this day, his cold ideas still hold an extremely important place in the sacred and inviolable concept of national sovereignty in international law. On today's highly sensitive international political stage, any rash move daring to infringe upon the territory of another nation is immediately and strictly viewed as a terrifying act declaring war. However, Although Machiavelli and Bodin both tacitly looked at everything from the cold perspective of the ruler, seeing only how to ruthlessly maintain and expand their hard-won power, what about the people struggling at the bottom? Are they merely a flock of lambs waiting to be slaughtered? Do they gain even the slightest bit of meager benefit from this extremely unequal, humiliating relationship with the absolute ruler? Do they willingly join this massive state federation, or are they violently kidnapped onto the chariot of power? Amidst the bloody artillery fire of the English Civil War in the 1640s, Thomas Hobbes stepped forward and provided an extremely pessimistic yet incredibly realistic answer. Hobbes cold-bloodedly believed that once humans are stripped of their hypocritical disguises, they are out-and-out selfish animals. Without any external power to strictly control them, they would instantly degenerate into a pack of mad wild dogs tearing at each other in the dark. Why? Because the extreme scarcity of resources on Earth inevitably forces humans to ruthlessly slaughter one another just to stay alive. In his masterpiece Leviathan, revered by later generations, he profoundly argued that humans are inherently extremely selfish monsters. They will unscrupulously do heinous things just to satisfy their bottomless self-interest. To completely tame this highly dangerous and manic human race, Hobbes firmly believed that a civilized state with absolute power is indispensable. Unlike Bodin, who strongly advocated the divine right of kings, Hobbes absolutely did not believe in such ethereal myths. He sharply pointed out that the ruler's authority absolutely does not stem from a god high above, nor from the ruler's fake bloodline, but from a cold social contract based on the exchange of interests. In this highly utilitarian contract, citizens hand over all their freedom in exchange for obeying the state, and the state, as the only return, must provide absolute violent protection. Hobbes had a bottomless despair and pessimism regarding the fundamental nature of humanity. He concluded that humans, as dangerous animals governed by desires, have a hidden barbaric and brutal nature deep inside with absolutely no so-called moral boundaries. Thus, we see that Machiavelli's ultimate goal was to greedily amass absolute personal power, Bodin's was to desperately maintain a fragile, permanent peace, and Hobbes's realistic goal was to use the shackles of violence to preserve the last shred of survival security for everyone. But these three cold-blooded intellectual giants shared an astonishing commonality. They all treated the ordinary people at the bottom like ignorant, low-IQ children. In their arrogant eyes, the people were like a mob of selfish, extremely immature, and absolutely untrustworthy dangerous thugs. Moreover, they stubbornly believed that this despicable human nature was a dead nut, as static as steel and forever unchangeable. Until our next intellectual giant abruptly appeared, attempting to elevate the dignity of those citizens trampled in the mud. He sought to tell the world that if granted a certain degree of autonomy under strict rules, these humans once viewed as beasts could actually display rare kindness and astonishing rationality. Immanuel Kant, the most renowned and rigorous rationalist philosopher, still cautiously echoed the arrogant, top-down approach of Machiavelli and Hobbes to some extent. He coldly pointed out that the massive machine of government absolutely does not need to cater to or follow policies meant merely to give ignorant citizens a superficial, shallow happiness. He realistically believed that on this human land filled with extreme uncertainty, having a powerful, centralized state is an absolute necessity for maintaining human existence. But as a calm, rationalist philosopher, he astutely perceived that the happiness people frantically pursue is actually an extremely subjective and transient illusion, like morning dew. Therefore, a truly mature political system must absolutely not hastily draft national laws to pursue the people's ethereal and highly volatile happiness. In Kant's rigorous social contract blueprint, citizens, as a vulnerable group protected by the state, have absolutely no legal right whatsoever to dangerously disobey the state machine that protects them. In fact, Kant publicly and firmly opposed the French Revolution, which turned Europe upside down. Because in his strict rational framework, any form of violent rebellion was a crude destruction of the fragile foundation of human civilization's rule of law, representing an absolute, catastrophic error. So Kant stubbornly believed that in this complex social contract, even if citizens are filled with extreme dissatisfaction or even agony toward the cold government above them, they have absolutely no right to rashly overthrow it, nor arrogantly refuse to obey its cold legal texts. However, on the other side of this strict coin, while citizens have an absolute obligation to bow their heads and obey the law, the previously unconstrained terrifying beast of the state must now also be tightly restrained in the cage of the law. In his famous, groundbreaking essay What is Enlightenment? Kant finally, rarely, displayed a new, highly optimistic view of humanity. He no longer treated humans as beasts needing to be severely whipped, but saw them as noble beings capable of reaching maturity through reason. Therefore, he strongly advocated formally granting humans their precious autonomy, allowing these rational individuals to make their own decisions in the vast universe. Thanks to this great and profound intellectual breakthrough, Kant is widely and reverently regarded by later generations as one of the most important intellectuals in the Enlightenment, the movement that illuminated the dark skies of Europe. Thus, all these intellectual giants struggling to think in turbulent times profoundly understood a cold iron rule: a coldly operating, stable state machine is far more important than the happiness of the people. In other words, in this cruel game of power, cold security always ruthlessly crushes fragile happiness and illusory freedom. Just as Europe was immersed in its extreme infatuation with the laws of nature, the wheels of the era turned quietly. The rapid advance of colonialism brought back mountains of gold and spices for Europe. This sudden windfall of massive wealth gave Europeans, who were originally struggling on the line of survival, the confidence to look down on nature. They were no longer satisfied with merely surviving safely like animals, they began to demand more. When the stomach is full, the desire for a better life grows wildly like weeds. And so, those words only previously whispered in dreams, freedom, equality, happiness, began to be shouted loudly in the squares of Europe. Humans not only successfully rebelled against God, but now they were also attempting to completely subdue the cruel nature that once made them tremble. The concept of seeking equality is actually as old as our human species itself, deeply rooted in our fragile instinct for survival. From early tribal members sharing captured prey around a campfire, to peasants in the feudal era launching bloody uprisings to seize land, the scarcity of material resources has always been the core fuse igniting fierce human conflict and political turmoil. This iron rule runs through all of human history. In 1775, a street riot triggered merely by soaring bread prices eventually escalated into a bloody revolution that sent the King of France to the guillotine. And in the distant East, a seemingly insignificant rice riot in 1918 directly unleashed a political tsunami that pushed the high and mighty Japanese government off the cliff of power. Although the beautiful vision of equality had lurked deep in the human subconscious for millennia, the chilling evolutionary laws of nature have always favored cruel competition. This law of the jungle logic is the most chilling yet irrefutable underlying fact in Darwin's theory of natural selection. Therefore, only when a society accumulated an extremely massive surplus of wealth through the roaring machines of the Industrial Revolution and the brutal plunder of international trade did the discussion of how to evenly distribute this wealth shift from an absurd fantasy into a politically viable agenda. It was against this backdrop in the 18th century, when Europeans became incredibly wealthy, that socialist currents began to hover like a specter over the European continent. However, reality is often full of pungent irony. While European colonizers and capitalists were richer than entire countries, the industrial workers toiling day and night in dark factories still lived in absolute poverty in slums. The meager charity occasionally handed out by nobles and wealthy merchants could never fill the bottomless chasm of inequality that swallowed countless fates. Thus, the French politician Pierre-Joseph Proudhon threw out a shocking statement in 1840 that terrified the entire bourgeoisie. In his book What is Property? He mercilessly and resolutely declared, "Property is theft." Why did he dare to propose such an extreme and subversive thesis? Because Proudhon sharply saw through the bloody nature of capital accumulation. He pointed out that no grand skyscraper in the world is built single-handedly by one person. Nor is any massive, highly profitable multinational corporation established and maintained by just a few executives. All the amazing wealth and miracles in society are ultimately the crystallized results of the blood, sweat, and collective efforts of tens of millions of bottom-tier laborers. But it is absurd and unfair that the tiny minority at the top of the pyramid uses cold legal contracts to brazenly claim absolute ownership of it all. Those at the bottom of society bearing the heaviest physical burdens and dirtying their hands struggle daily on the edge of survival yet remain unfed. Meanwhile, the elites with clean hands who have never done an ounce of physical labor somehow legally pocket all the resources of society. Proudhon believed the culprit behind this pathologically torn state was the completely monopolized and out-of-control machinery of political power. When power is highly concentrated in the hands of a very few oligarchs, it naturally transforms into an indestructible protective umbrella, allowing this minority to unscrupulously control the lifeblood of the nation. According to cold statistics, the underlying motive for nearly 85% of criminal behavior is inextricably linked to a lack of property. The vested interests who already possess massive private property astutely use politics and the state machine as their private armed security. By enacting draconian laws, they coldly define any attempt by the poor to touch or redistribute wealth as illegal crime. In Proudhon's angry eyes, this massive material inequality is essentially a severe and unforgivable antisocial crime. Because it cruelly allows a tiny minority to recklessly squander the nation's massive wealth while ruthlessly excluding the vast majority of people who created it. Proudhon thoroughly despised this oppression. He even declared that any so-called sovereign who tried to place a hand on him to rule over him was a tyrant and an enemy who must be destroyed. While Proudhon naively hoped to gently return power and wealth to the lower classes through anarchist cooperatives, a student of his heavily influenced by Hegelian philosophy saw through the fragility and impotence of this mild reform with cold, piercing eyes. Karl Marx, the intellectual giant who shook the entire modern world, made his heavyweight debut with his scientific materialism. Marx astutely pointed out that if current material inequality is merely a historical product shaped by previous generations, this means humanity has the initiative to use thunderous violence to smash this old world and rewrite the course of history. Marx firmly agreed with Proudhon that the massive private property in the hands of capitalists was absolutely blood money stolen from workers. But he was colder and far more realistic than Proudhon. He knew deeply that absolutely no thief in this world would discover their conscience and voluntarily return the wealth. The only way to break the deadlock was for the proletariat of the world to immediately unite and use the fiercest armed revolution to forcibly take back what belonged to them from the thieves. Marx precisely divided humanity's long, suffering-filled history into 5 bloody stages of class struggle, from the initial primitive communism where people shared everything, to the cruel oppression of slavery, to the feudalism where landlords ruthlessly exploited peasants, until the current capitalist era that severely tore society into a few greedy capitalists and a massive, suffering working class. Marx confidently predicted that the final train of history would inevitably roll into the final destination of communism, where everyone shares material resources. Although Marx meticulously drafted the blood-boiling, grand blueprint of communism in a Western European study filled with the rich aroma of coffee, the one who actually picked up the trowel and tried to forcibly build this edifice on the crumbling world was his iron-fisted disciple far away in cold Russia. Vladimir Lenin, after carefully studying Marx's works, keenly discovered a fatal deviation in actual execution. Marx's theory was tailor-made for highly industrialized Western European countries with mature working classes, like Germany and the UK. Lenin, through cruel revolutionary practice, knew deeply that the bottom-tier worker groups were often extremely lacking in organizational discipline, even showing extreme blindness and stupidity much of the time. World War I was a tragic and bloody proof of this. European workers who should have united across borders instead slaughtered each other in trenches for the nationalist interests of their respective countries. To solve this fatal flaw that could abort the revolution, Lenin decisively introduced the Vanguard Party, a political tool as hard as steel. This party had to possess extremely strong centralization and operate efficiently in a cold, top-down, dictatorial manner. Although this sounds completely contrary to the spirit of absolute equality advocated by Marx, Lenin believed this was the indispensable violent bulldozer needed to overthrow the massive old world. Moreover, Russia at the time was essentially a massive, extremely backward feudal agricultural society where capitalism was just taking its first steps. Lenin pragmatically realized it was impossible to reach the sky in one step, so he created a transitional period called socialism, state capitalism governed by absolute state control. He ruthlessly deployed state violence to confiscate all private property and means of production, handing them entirely over to a massive, bloated state bureaucracy to maintain tight control. The massive state machine of the Soviet Union established by Lenin and his Bolshevik Party in 1917 became even colder and more suffocating after Joseph Stalin took over. Stalin clearly recognized that in a harsh international environment surrounded by wolves, even a utopia pursuing equality required a hardline leader with an iron fist. If we are just a flock of meek sheep without an extremely tough, even cold-blooded shepherd, this newborn red regime would soon be torn to pieces by capitalist powers. Thus, Stalin thoroughly practiced Machiavelli's cold-blooded political philosophy that the ends justify the means, turning the country into an absolutely obedient machine of war and industry. He ruthlessly eliminated all voices of opposition, sending countless former comrades in arms and so-called enemies to the freezing gulags and labor camps of Siberia. As Lenin's communist experiment struggled to hold on in Europe, far away in the east, Mao Zedong took up this heavy red banner. Mao faced the same massive problem of Marx's theory being severely mismatched with China's massive, backward agricultural reality. He ingeniously fused the Russian socialist model with the anti-colonial nationalism that had been thoroughly ignited in the Chinese people through the flames of war. This master strategist, deeply versed in Chinese history, the art of war, and the philosophy of deception and survival found in the classic novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, scattered the seeds of revolution among the hundreds of millions of oppressed peasants in the vast countryside. Through the Long March, an absolute miracle in human military history, he not only tenaciously preserved the strength of the revolution but also built a massive, invincible peasant army like a centipede. Mao profoundly remembered Rousseau's teaching: people in the countryside are often purer and kinder, while those in the cities are utterly corrupted by capitalist vanity. Therefore, after seizing power, he forcibly launched the Cultural Revolution, attempting to force city-pampered residents to go to the mud of the countryside to accept a thorough baptism of the soul. Although this extremely radical egalitarian attempt exacted an unimaginably tragic toll on the entire society, even causing the shattering of countless families and the loss of lives, it is undeniable that this obsession with seeking absolute equality left a profound mark on the land of 20th century China. When the Chinese Communist Party later pragmatically reintroduced capitalist competition mechanisms into this massive economy, private property once again unleashed its tremendous magic in stimulating the economy. All of this proves a cruel biological iron rule: the deep-seated human instinct to gain an evolutionary edge through competition cannot be completely erased. This preference for competition cold-bloodedly guarantees the survival of the fittest, thus driving the explosive advancement of the entire social economy on a macro level. When leftist thinkers were unleashing oceans of blood to build massive, suffocating bureaucratic states in the name of absolute material equality, right-wing thinkers at the other end of the political spectrum sharply pointed out the fatal price behind this forcefully manufactured equality. In their view, when you are hungry, you desire someone to share half a loaf of bread with you. That is a demand for equality born of the survival instinct. But when your stomach is completely full and your survival is no longer threatened, the most frantic desire deep in your heart immediately transforms into a pursuit of unconstrained freedom. Political freedom itself is an extremely fascinating paradox, because the essence of politics is using the state machine and the shackles of law to restrain individual barbaric behavior. Montesquieu, an extremely astute French judge, believed that it is precisely these seemingly restrictive, cold laws that truly protect our freedom from being trampled upon by tyrants. He brilliantly deduced that if a state simultaneously controls the absolute powers to make laws, interpret laws, and execute laws, then this state is destined to degenerate into a terrifying beast committing acts of tyranny in the name of justice. To completely dismantle this political bomb hanging over humanity, he proposed the great concept revered as a standard by modern civilization: the separation of powers. The legislative, executive, and judicial branches must strictly check and balance each other like an incredibly stable tripod, never allowing any single branch to hold an overwhelming absolute power. Meanwhile, Voltaire wielded his razor-sharp intellectual scalpel, ruthlessly stabbing at the two mortal enemies stifling personal freedom: the church and the aristocracy. He angrily attacked the Catholic Church's harsh blockade on thought, as well as those parasitic nobles who enjoyed privileges simply by birthright without lifting a finger. He fanatically believed that only by allowing good and bad ideas to fiercely clash without reservation in society, and allowing public skepticism and freedom of speech, could civilization truly flourish. As the winds of freedom blew across the Atlantic, Alexis de Tocqueville smelled an extremely dangerous scent on the European continent. He was horrified to find that socialism, spreading madly across Europe to manufacture a lifeless equality, had become the most terrifying assassin of freedom. Tocqueville sharply pointed out that the heavy bulldozer of socialism would coldly crush every independent soul full of personality into a lifeless cog on the machine of collectivism. In contrast, he had high praise for the democratic system in the United States, which deeply revered individualism, limited government power, and allowed individuals the freedom to pursue wealth. But America's Henry David Thoreau contemptuously thought Tocqueville's view of government was still too naive and compromising. Thoreau obsessively believed that America's astonishing progress relied entirely on creative individual geniuses, absolutely not on that bloated government. He proudly declared that the best government in the world is the one that governs least, the one with the lowest presence. Facing the highly immoral act of the U.S. government retaining slavery, he even bravely proposed the great concept of civil disobedience, preferring to go to jail rather than pay taxes to evil. Along this wild path of individualism, the German madman Friedrich Nietzsche pushed freedom to a chilling extreme. Nietzsche utterly loathed equality, viewing the religious and socialist ideals of protecting the weak and suppressing genius as slave morality that hindered human evolution. He arrogantly declared that God is dead, and humanity could finally break free from all the hypocritical shackles of religion and morality to pursue the realm of the Übermensch, Superman, possessing the absolute will to power. Under the suffocating shadow of the Cold War, the Austrian-born economist Friedrich Hayek prescribed a strong medicine for the free market. He sharply pointed out that any top-down government economic control is essentially a despotic tyranny leading down the road to serfdom, because it controls all the means of human survival. True freedom only exists in the ruthless free market, completely free from government intervention, where consumers cast their most genuine votes with their hard-earned cash. The left does not hesitate to use the state machine to restrict personal freedom for the sake of illusory equality. The right, to defend absolute individual freedom, would rather watch society tear itself apart in competition. This cruel tearing between equality and freedom has triggered countless wars and bloodshed over the past 2 centuries, yet it has never provided a perfect answer. Since humanity has bumped its head against the wall in the sociological maze of pursuing equality and freedom, perhaps we should change our perspective. If we strip away these glamorous cloaks of ideology and return to our most primitive state as a biological species, will the answer become clear? When we strip away the gorgeous ideological cloaks carefully woven by philosophers and return to the essence of flesh and blood, you will find that the most primitive engines driving this massive human machine are actually just 2 extremely hidden biological buttons. The first button is called dopamine. It is our endless, frantic craving for happiness and extreme pleasure. The second button is called oxytocin. It is our deep-seated, terrifying fear of loneliness, which makes us desperately crave the herd instinct to belong to a tribe. After experiencing the repeated failures of egalitarian experiments, leftist thinkers began to turn their gaze toward maximizing human utility and happiness. Right-wing thinkers, after witnessing the extreme selfishness and social atomization brought about by liberalism, began to frantically call for the return of nationalism and the tribe. These 2 biological impulses rooted deep in our monkey brains ultimately push human politics toward a chilling ultimate singularity. Let us first press the first button to see how humanity turned the pursuit of happiness into an extremely precise and cold political philosophy. As early as ancient Greece, the philosopher Epicurus acutely perceived humanity's animal instinct to seek pleasure and avoid pain. He led a group of friends to escape the noisy city-state of Athens and established a hippo-like community resembling a utopia. There, they did not discuss ethereal state affairs. They focused only on enjoying food, friendship, and the simplest pleasures in life. Centuries later, the Dutch philosopher Erasmus, in his shocking In Praise of Folly, bluntly tore off the disguise of human rationality. Using a biting dark humor, he pointed out that living in this world full of suffering is simply too painful and difficult. If humans truly maintained absolute sobriety and rationality, most people would probably have chosen self-destruction long ago because they couldn't bear the absurdity of existence. Therefore, a moderate amount of stupidity and indulgence in sensory pleasures is actually the best anesthetic nature bestowed upon humanity to numb the pain. David Hume, the exceptionally wise Scottish philosopher, decisively dragged politics down from the altar back to the smoke-filled human world. He believed that humans, most of the time, are not driven by any noble morality or cold rationality, but are firmly dominated by surging passions. We shouldn't judge a political system by how beautiful its slogans sound, but by whether it is actually useful in practical experience. This pragmatic concept of utility, completely based on human experience, laid a solid first cornerstone for the later edifice of utilitarianism. Then, an English eccentric named Jeremy Bentham coldly pushed this idea to the extreme, turning it into a precise calculator. Bentham had studied the legal system of his time extensively and found it filled with meaningless pain inflicted solely for the sake of punishment. So he sat down and asked a simple yet fatal question: how exactly can politics make humans feel true happiness? Bentham bluntly pointed out that nature has long placed mankind under the absolute sovereignty of 2 brutal masters, pain and pleasure. Every decision we make in life, whether eating a piece of chocolate or launching a war, is essentially to pursue pleasure and escape pain. Since the moral undertone of humanity is so full of biological animalism, the sole purpose of politics becomes clear. It must act like a calculating entrepreneur to secure the greatest happiness for the greatest number. To achieve this goal, Bentham believed the government should shrink the boundaries of its power as much as possible, becoming a pure social mechanic. Just like when you drive a broken-down car into a garage, you only hope the grease-covered mechanic honestly fixes the engine. You absolutely do not want the mechanic sitting in the passenger seat chattering endlessly about which road you should take or criticizing your music taste. The same goes for the government. It should only intervene cautiously where it can genuinely increase the overall happiness of society, for example, by severely cracking down on the minority of criminals who disrupt social peace. Because only by ruthlessly picking those bad apples that cause pain out of the social basket can the safety and happiness of the vast majority be maximized. Bentham's ideas perfectly aligned with the wildly expanding free market capitalism of the time, allowing people to comfortably immerse themselves in the frantic pursuit of material wealth. But this cold happiness calculator, which only looked at numbers, soon exposed its terrifyingly fatal flaw. If, in order to grant immense happiness to 99 people, it is permissible to mercilessly sacrifice one innocent person on the altar of doom, is that truly justice? This logic, fearfully termed the tyranny of the majority by later generations, sent a deep shiver down the spine of Bentham's star pupil, John Stuart Mill. Mill attempted to carefully patch up his teacher's heavily flawed utilitarian theory. He tried to introduce a dimension of quality alongside the quantity of happiness. He proudly declared that it is far better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. Mill firmly believed that if a society only knows how to pursue low-level sensory stimulation like animals, it will sooner or later completely rot in vulgarity. To prevent humanity from sinking completely into the quagmire of hedonism, Mill ingeniously introduced personal freedom as the ultimate weapon into the utilitarian framework. He believed a healthy society must act like a vibrant free market, allowing all sorts of terrible and even heretical voices to exist. Because only in the free collision and trial and error process can peerless geniuses like Mozart or Newton break the shackles of mediocrity. The great art and science they create might cause pain and misunderstanding in the present, but in the long run, they will bring immeasurable, massive utility to all of humanity. Therefore, for Mill, freedom is not the ultimate goal of politics, it is merely a sharp tool used by humanity to acquire higher-level happiness and longer-term utility. This carefully packaged utilitarianism eventually evolved into the tide of consumerism that firmly rules our world today. Modern capitalism has precisely manipulated the biological switch in our brains that craves dopamine, making us work frantically like wind-up toys. Then, it makes us wildly squander our hard-earned money on goods that bring brief thrills, all to prove the value of our existence. When utilitarianism is pushed to the extreme, humanity inevitably slides into the abyss of nihilism. We sadly discover that aside from being a bunch of monkeys craving pleasure, the meaning of life seems to have been completely hollowed out. Since pursuing happiness leaves us feeling so empty and lost, humanity naturally presses the second biological button, the deep craving for a sense of belonging. This leads to the other powerful and highly dangerous force in modern politics, conservatism centered on nationalism. As social animals that have evolved over millions of years in the harsh natural world, we have a profound fear of loneliness deep within our hearts. We yearn to merge into a collective that is grander and more sacred than ourselves. We long to huddle closely with those who share the same blood and speak the same language. This highly primitive tribal impulse is the exact underlying emotional bond that allows modern nation-states to form and maintain their massive rule. The French Revolution, while shouting for freedom and equality, shrewdly added the slogan of fraternity, brotherhood, filled with tribal camaraderie. Because they deeply understood that without a sense of community connected like bloodlines, no beautiful political slogan could ever rally an army willing to die for it. Montesquieu once tried to use cold climate theories to explain the huge differences in human political character. He believed the cold north created lone wolves who loved freedom, while the warm south bred populations more addicted to sensory pleasure. This profound environmental shaping of human character also became, to some extent, the backdrop for national differences. But the one who truly ignited nationalism and bestowed it with a sacred halo was the German thinker Johann Gottfried Herder. Herder fanatically opposed the Enlightenment's arrogant universalist illusion that all of humanity possesses the same rationality. In his romantic eyes, there is absolutely no universal truth applicable everywhere, nor is there any abstract global citizen. Humans are like fish strictly confined to different ponds. Every culture, every language is a unique, closed ecosystem. Language is not just a tool for communication, it is the sacred spiritual code of a nation, shaping a unique national spirit belonging exclusively to that people. When you listen to your country's ancient myths and rousing national anthems with tears in your eyes, that intense resonance is something no foreign culture can ever trigger. As modernity rapidly advanced, cold individualism acted like a sharp knife, cutting traditional families and communities into fragmented pieces. The Italian thinker Giuseppe Mazzini watched with indignation as people turned into selfish, lonely atoms in the steel jungle of capitalism. He loudly proclaimed that for the poor struggling in the mud at the bottom, so-called personal freedom was nothing but a cruel illusion given as charity by the rulers. The true meaning of human existence is absolutely not to pursue personal interests like wandering ghosts, but rather to tightly integrate into a great national community. He affectionately painted a picture of the nation, arguing that a country is not just a few cold borders on a map, it is a blood and flesh connection filled with love. Mazzini's romantic national brotherhood, however, bore terrifying poisonous fruit in later history. Giovanni Gentile pushed this fanatical worship of the state to a suffocating extreme, directly providing the core theoretical ammunition for Italy's fascist regime. In the fanatical narrative of fascism, the state became the sole embodiment of all spiritual value, while the individual was completely erased and swallowed. Just like the origin of the word fascism, a bundle of sticks, fasces, a single stick is easily broken, but when everyone is forcibly bound together, they become an indestructible violent machine. In this terrifying system, the sole purpose of an individual's life is to burn themselves completely without reservation, like fuel, to illuminate the supreme glory of the state. The 1940s of the 20th century witnessed a cataclysmic supercollision of these extreme ideologies on Earth. It was a brutal life-and-death struggle between fascism demanding absolute obedience, liberalism defending personal autonomy, and socialism craving material equality. Although the war machines of fascism and Nazism were ultimately smashed to pieces in the ruins of 1945, the massive beast of nationalism did not die. Instead, riding the gale of anti-colonialism, it rapidly swept across the ancient lands of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East that were once oppressed. To this day, when we unfold a world map, what we see is absolutely not a distribution map of freedom, equality, or happiness, but an intricately tangled map of divided nation-states. Under this massive and seemingly unbreakable system of nation-states today, have we truly achieved the security and belonging we desired? Or have we merely been tamed and exploited in a much more insidious way by those astute authorities hiding behind the scenes? The French postmodernist thinker Michel Foucault, like a cold social anatomist, ruthlessly cut open the painted skin of power with his sharp scalpel. In Foucault's profound gaze, power is not at all some specific object held tightly in the hands of a king or president. Rather, it is a ubiquitous, microscopic web of relationships. If you try to find an absolute center of power, you will discover there is nothing there. That supposedly powerful state is nothing but a vain emperor wearing new clothes. Foucault sharply pointed out that what rules us today is no longer the brutal monarch of ancient times who could arbitrarily chop off our heads. Instead, it is a complete set of precise, complex control technologies and disciplines that have permeated every tiny corner of our lives. From the strict seating arrangements when you walk into an exam room, to the boss's cold regulations regarding your dress code and clocking in at the company, to the surveillance cameras on the street staring at you like a dense cluster of eyes, and the IDs you must humbly present every time you encounter the police. Modern society has successfully and ingeniously internalized a massive panopticon into the subconscious of every single one of us. We foolishly believe we possess the right to choose freely between the left and the right, completely unaware that this is nothing but a political illusion manufactured by the system to pacify us. No matter who we solemnly check on the ballot, this massive and cold bureaucratic machine continues to operate steadily according to its own cruel logic. Postmodernists despairingly discovered that the so-called modernity is actually a massive scam. Not only did it fail to completely liberate us from the cage, but it also replaced the ancient religious shackles with a hidden, precise modern prison named the human state. In this long and tragically bloody history of political evolution, humanity seems to be irreversibly heading toward a terrifying final singularity. Let us return to the profound and cruel animal fable at the very beginning of this video. A flock of sheep spends their entire lives fearing the greedy green eyes in the forest, but the one who ultimately serves them elegantly onto the dining table is the shepherd they trusted. Over the past 2,500 years, humanity has been like that fragile flock of sheep fearing slaughter from their own kind. To seek meager protection, we voluntarily handed over our fangs and claws, willingly giving ourselves completely over to those powerful shepherds called kings, churches, or states to manage. If there were no external, ferocious hungry wolves constantly posing a fatal threat to us, we wouldn't need this oppressive political system at all. The entire and sole justification for why shepherds can legally milk us, shear our wool, and even brutally determine our life and death is built on their ability to effectively protect us from the bloody bites of external enemies. But what if, in the distant future, human society inevitably merges into a massive super-hive with no external enemies? When there is only one unified political entity left on this planet, the wolf that once terrified us will completely disappear. By then, what reasonable excuse will the shepherds use to continue maintaining their absolute rule and plunder over us? The answer perhaps hides within the cold and precise algorithms of modern technology, hidden in the brave new world accurately prophesied by Aldous Huxley. When violence and cruel wars are no longer effective means to maintain rule, the super-hive will activate a despair-inducing new control program. They will no longer crudely restrict your body, but will precisely cater to and completely manipulate your underlying biological desires. Through abundant and cheap synthetic food, through overflowing and meaningless sensory stimulation, through digital dopamine capable of instantly numbing all pain, that omniscient, omnipotent artificial intelligence shepherd will perfectly embed every single one of us into this massive super-hive. We will no longer have angry resistance, nor profound philosophical thoughts. We will merely exhaust our lives in an illusion of happiness like docile worker bees. Is this the perfect political endpoint that humanity has arrived at after sprinting all the way from the cruel laws of the jungle? We spent a full 2,500 years arduously overthrowing the rule of natural gods and arrogantly establishing humanity's absolute sovereignty, only to ultimately, in this grand game of civilization, perfectly forge a digital chain we cannot break free from with our own hands. If you have had the patience to accompany me all the way to the end of this profound and lengthy journey of political thought, I must express my highest respect to you. At this moment, after listening to the deafening cries of those great sages spanning thousands of years, among the many political thinkers shining with the light of wisdom or exuding a cold smell of blood, which profound concept has plucked the hidden strings deep in your heart the most? Or let me toss out an even more chilling and thought-provoking ultimate question. In this mighty and irreversible frenzy of evolution, where do you think this lonely giant ship of humanity is inevitably heading? As always, I am deeply and sincerely grateful that you spent the precious time of your life to accompany me in completing this great intellectual exploration. I am Raymond Shadow. Thank you for liking and subscribing, it means a lot to me. See you in the next episode.